You remember a world that moved slower than this one. You remember when phones stayed at home, when the internet made a sound before it connected, when plans were made in advance and people actually showed up. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, you belong to a generation that rarely talks about itself. Generation X. And if you've ever felt slightly out of place in today's loud, fast, constantly online culture, there's a psychological reason for that, because the world that shaped you was very different from the world that exists today. First, Gen X grew up during a time when independence wasn't optional. Many parents worked long hours. Supervision was lighter. Kids often came home to empty houses. The term latchkey kid came from this exact experience. You let yourself in, made your own snacks, figured things out. That kind of childhood does something important to the brain. It builds self-reliance early. You learn that problems are often yours to solve. But independence also builds something else, a quiet emotional toughness. Gen X wasn't raised in a culture that constantly discussed feelings. Problems were handled privately. Disappointments were processed internally. So many people from this generation developed a psychological habit. Handle things yourself. Don't complain too much. Keep moving. Another defining factor was uncertainty. Gen X grew up during major global shifts. The Cold War, economic recessions, rapid technological change. The future often felt unpredictable. That environment trains the brain to expect instability. And when the brain expects instability, it becomes adaptable, flexible, sometimes even skeptical. That's why many Gen X adults approach trends carefully. They've seen systems change before. Another interesting psychological trait comes from growing up before the internet. Information wasn't instant. If you wanted to know something, you had to search for it. Libraries, books, encyclopedias. This trained patience. It also trained deeper focus. When attention isn't constantly interrupted, the brain learns to stay with one thing longer. Many Gen X individuals still carry that mental rhythm today. Relationships were shaped differently too. Before texting, before social media, most communication was direct. Phone calls, face-to-face conversations. Misunderstandings were resolved in real time. There was less room for endless interpretation. And because social life wasn't constantly displayed online, identity developed more privately. You didn't measure your life through likes or follower counts. Your social circle was smaller, but often more grounded. Work psychology also reflects the era. Gen X entered adulthood during a time when traditional career paths were shifting. Corporate loyalty was fading. Companies restructured. Layoffs became common. Many people saw their parents lose stable jobs. That experience shaped a cautious mindset. Work hard, but don't blindly trust institutions. Build your own security. This is one reason Gen X often values independence at work. And this is where the psychology becomes interesting. Gen X stands between two very different worlds, before digital life, and after it, they remember renting movies from stores. But they also adapted to streaming. They remember handwritten letters, but they also live with instant messaging. They remember life before algorithms started shaping attention. This dual experience creates a unique perspective. Gen X understands technology, but they're not completely dependent on it. They know how to disconnect, because they remember what life felt like before constant connection. Another quiet psychological trait is emotional restraint, not because Gen X lacks emotion, but because expression was trained differently. Many grew up in households where vulnerability wasn't openly discussed, so emotional processing often became internal. This creates resilience, but it can also create distance. Some Gen X adults are still learning how to share feelings openly. But there's also strength in this balance. Gen X developed a strong internal compass. They rely less on external validation, less on public approval, more on personal judgment. And in a world driven by online reactions, that independence can be powerful. Here's the deeper psychological truth. Every generation is shaped by the environment it grows up in. For Gen X, that environment was transitional, analog childhood, digital adulthood, independence early, uncertainty often. So the Gen X mindset became a mix of realism and adaptability. They're comfortable figuring things out, comfortable standing alone, comfortable questioning systems, not because they want to rebel, but because they've already seen how quickly systems can change. And that's why many people from this generation carry a quiet strength. They don't always talk about it. They don't always show it, but it's there. A mindset shaped by independence, adaptability, and a world that taught them early that stability isn't guaranteed. And maybe that's the real psychology of Gen X, a generation that learned to navigate change quietly, while building a kind of resilience that rarely asks for attention.